I need to change that. Good evening. I am Charles Overby, President and CEO of the Freedom Forum, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here tonight. The Freedom Forum is dedicated to using its resources to promoting free press, free speech, and free spirit. We're the largest organization in the world that has these freedoms as its primary mission. We're independent politically and financially. We don't raise money. We're here for the long haul. I hope you'll enjoy these facilities tonight. They were built to be the center of activities for the next 40 years. Public opinion about free press and free speech and free spirit may rise and fall, but these facilities will be here to stand as a beacon for freedom in good times and in bad times well into the 21st century. The Freedom Forum is what its name implies, a forum for freedom. We work with media experts and the public at large to advance the mission of freedom. This involves conferences, seminars, publications, and promotion across the USA and around the world. The Freedom Forum tonight is especially pleased to join with American University in sponsoring this international conference on free expression and global media. I'm pleased tonight to be able to introduce someone who seems to get almost as much on-the-air TV time as Mike Wallace. For all of you C-SPAN watchers, and who of us is not one, you know that Sandy Unger is on his way to becoming a household word and face. As Dean of the School of Communications at American University, Sandy is the moderator of frequent forums sponsored by American University, frequently carried on C-SPAN. He's not only an educator, he's a bona fide journalist. I'm pleased to introduce him now. Welcome, Sandy Unger.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to the Freedom Forum for joining us in this very exciting endeavor. For several days now, we've been talking about freedom of expression around the world. We've been joined by courageous journalists from 39 countries, by heroes and heroines that we can all salute and feel honored to be in their company. We're also honored to be in the company tonight of one of America's leading journalists, the man, it's almost impossible to believe that for many years the leading television program, top-rated television program in the United States should be a program dealing with the news, with public affairs. And I think the one person who has been most important in making that possible is someone we all admire, Mike Wallace. I give you Mike Wallace.
Thank you. As Sandy said, for a few days now, for 2.5, 3 days now, at this ambitious and useful conference sponsored by the American University School of Communication and Freedom Forum, you've been exploring the various barriers to free expression around the globe, and they are formidable barriers. Government-imposed censorship, of course. Problems in covering civil wars, drug trafficking, the exercise of control over the media by public and/or private owners, government-dictated constraints on coverage of national security affairs, and for every barrier that you have discussed, one or more of you have suggested a solution or an end run. But some problems, some barriers, are too difficult to be attacked by a handful of mere journalists. When a powerful force, whether an individual or a corporation, or even an entire nation, sets out deliberately to stop an individual writer or a journalist, all writers, all journalists have to respond to the challenge. And when a powerful force sets out to intimidate a single publisher or a single broadcast organization, all publishers, all broadcasters must be ready to respond. As journalists, we are all of us familiar with the high and sometimes even fatal cost of sharing our information and ideas with the public. In the past half-century, thousands of our peers have been wounded, some of them killed, while trying to report information from around the world. The statistics are stunning. Last year alone, 66 foreign correspondents and local journalists were killed, the highest number recorded by the Committee to Protect Journalists since its beginning back in 1981. The first 7 months of the Yugoslav conflict alone saw 19 journalists killed, plus 2 more missing and presumed dead, the highest rate in modern warfare. In 1991, in over 100 countries, 324 journalists were detained, 156 attacked physically, 42 expelled from countries, 66 publications or broadcasters were banned, and 27 editorial offices were raided. But while violence against us has taken a high toll, we keep coming back to pursue the story, and by our own collective persistence, we keep the pressure on, so those powerful forces who would intimidate us become the focus of even more intense scrutiny. But there are instances when even collective action may not be enough. Those in control of an entire nation state have singled out individual reporters as they have hunted, found, and extinguished them. One example, 42 years ago, CBS correspondent George Polk shot in the head in the course of his reporting on the Greek junta. In the 4 decades since, the violence has not only not subsided, but it has reached across borders and come to us here in America. Last month, in my hometown, New York City, the crusading editor-in-chief of El Diario, Manuel de Dios, was murdered, apparently by the drug lords who have done their best to dominate the politics of several Latin countries. This was the 3rd killing of a journalist covering international affairs on U.S. soil in the past 15 months. In 1991, Haitian radio talk show hosts Fritz Dor and Jean-Claude Olivier were executed down in Miami, presumably by supporters of Haiti's current military dictatorship. Internationally, there are many, many other examples of attempts by governments to reach out and eradicate individuals for publishing their ideas or broadcasting their words. We, all of us, are limited individually in what we can do. For those so persecuted, we can listen carefully to their stories, and regardless of whether we like what they have said or written, published, we can, of course, make it clear that we support their right to say it. And we can insist that our governments pressure renegade governments to cease punishing those who would exercise their universal right of free expression. But when it comes to the use of violence by governments to suppress information and ideas, the case of one man stands out before all others. And I am speaking, of course, of British author Salman Rushdie. His case is well known, but may not be sufficiently understood. Let me take a moment to tell you about it. Salman Rushdie was born to a Muslim family in Bombay in 1947, schooled in England, became a citizen, and by 1988, he had become an honored member of the international writing community. 2 of his novels, Midnight's Children and Shame, were widely acclaimed, but they were controversial too. Midnight's Children was banned in India. Shame was banned in Pakistan. He was deemed controversial also for a short and sympathetic book about the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua. So, controversy was not entirely unexpected when his book, The Satanic Verses, first appeared in Britain in September of 1988. A month later, The Satanic Verses had been banned by the Indian government under pressure from Muslim leaders who insisted that 2 chapters of that novel, which involved a prophet who is and is not Muhammad, were insulting to Islam and blasphemous to the Prophet. And by the end of that month, every country or city throughout the world with a sizable Muslim population had seen angry protests. And then, in February of '89, the publication of the American edition of Rushdie's novel brought new dimension to the controversy. First, it was greeted by a wave of violent protest in Bombay, Kashmir, and Dhaka. On February 12th, 2,000 people stormed the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad, and Pakistani police opened fire. At least 5 persons were killed, more than 100 injured. The next day, that scene was televised around the world. On February 14th in Tehran, the late Ayatollah Khomeini issued a religious edict, a fatwa, calling on Muslims everywhere to kill Salman Rushdie and his publishers. On the following day, thousands of protesters stoned the recently reopened British embassy in Tehran, and then a senior Iranian cleric, Hassani Sansi, who heads the June 5th Foundation, promised a bounty of $3 million to any Iranian and $1 million to any foreigner who would kill Rushdie. In the 3 years since, Salman Rushdie has lived underground, protected by Scotland Yard's special branch. Despite his repeated attempts to repair relations with the Islamic world through an apology for offending Islam, and despite diplomatic protests to Tehran, the fatwa has repeatedly been renewed. In October of 1990, the United Kingdom renewed diplomatic relations with Iran on the expectation that the fatwa would be lifted. But despite additional international diplomacy, it has not been lifted, and so Salman Rushdie remains underground. Beside the threat to Rushdie, the American publishing community itself had been intimidated from issuing a paperback edition of his novel until just 2 weeks ago, when an anonymous consortium representing, we are told, most U.S. publishers announced that it would publish the paperback edition of the Satanic Verses. However, as the Washington Post pointed out editorially just yesterday, all was not bravery leading up to the paperback's publication here in the United States. The Post wrote, "Consortiums in Germany, Italy, France, and other places have banded together, names and all, as a way to spread the risk, but still array themselves in public against transcontinental bullying." Apparently there was a similar plan for the United States, names and all, that fell apart when several of the major players declined to get involved. So instead of publishers and others putting their mouths where their money is, they decided to hide behind a consortium of anonymity in the United States. I first met Salman Rushdie about 18 months ago when I interviewed him in a secret place for 60 minutes. He had been a hostage of his fatwa then for 20 months. Now it has been 38 months, 3 long and painful years. But rather than have me tell you more of his story, I suggest that you listen to the man whose life I have been describing, and then we can best decide how we should each of us deal individually and together with such an extraordinary and lingering threat to free expression. Salman?
So what am I doing here? Well, I mean, to start off with, I must thank my hosts and everybody who helped to make this trip possible, which was not a simple matter. What I'd like to do is to start by asking you to think about that lack of simplicity for a moment, and just to remind yourself how very odd it is for a writer interested in human rights and freedom of expression to accept an invitation to speak at a conference like this, should be a simple matter. It should not be necessary for travel plans to be shrouded in secrecy. Security forces should not need to pay me any special attention. None of this should be happening in quite this way. Feels a little bit, doesn't it, like being inside one of those science fiction yarns in which the present gets unaccountably altered, so that all of a sudden the Inquisition appears in Piccadilly Circus and there are witch burnings on the Potomac. It feels a little like living in the Twilight Zone. There was a saying that was popular in the hippie days of the 1960s that seems appropriate now. It ran, "Do not adjust your mind, there is a fault in reality." Well, the fatwa of Imam Khomeini bent the world out of shape. Ancient bloodlusts were unleashed, armed with state-of-the-art modern technology. Battles that we thought didn't need to be fought anymore. Battles about ideas such as blasphemy and heresy, which throughout human history have been the stormtroopers of bigotry, were reenacted in our streets. Many people who should have known better tried to defend the real and the threatened violence and blamed its victims. Even now, in Britain, there is a powerful lobby which quite regularly describes me as a person of no value. And I do not exaggerate when I say that the power of this lobby is so great that I am no longer certain of the commitment of the British authorities to protecting me. I do not say this lightly. I do not say it without reasons. I am no longer certain of the commitment of the British authorities to the task of protecting me. So I say again, there is a fault in reality. Do not adjust your minds. What has been done to the Satanic Verses, its author, its publisher, translators and booksellers, is one of the great crimes against freedom of recent years. The novel is not the crime. The author is not the criminal. It's time to say that this miscarriage of justice cannot continue. The peculiar evil of silencing the expression of an opinion is that it is robbing the human race, posterity as well as the existing generation, robbing those who dissent from the opinion still more than those who hold it. For if the opinion is right, they are deprived of the opportunity of exchanging error for truth. If wrong, they lose what is almost as great a benefit, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth produced by its collision with error. Some of you may have recognized those are not my words. They come from John Stuart Mill's great essay on liberty. It is extraordinary how much of Mill's essay applies directly to the case of the Satanic Verses. The demand for the banning of this novel and indeed the eradication of its author is precisely what Mill called the assumption of infallibility. Those who make such demands do so, just as Mill anticipated, because they find the book and its author immoral and impious. But, he writes, this is the case of all others in which the assumption of infallibility is most fatal. These are exactly the occasions on which the men of one generation commit those dreadful mistakes which excite the astonishment and horror of posterity. He gives two examples of such occasions, the cases of Socrates and of Jesus Christ. To these can be added a third case, that of Galileo. All three men, in all three cases, the accusation was blasphemy and heresy. All three were attacked by the stormtroopers of bigotry. And yet, as is plain to anyone, they are the founders of the philosophical, moral, and scientific traditions of the West. We can say, therefore, that the processes known as blasphemy and heresy, far from being the greatest of evils, are the methods by which human thought has made some of its most vital advances. The writers of the European Enlightenment knew this. They all came up against the stormtroopers at one time or another, and it was because of his nervousness of the power of the church, not the power of the state, that Voltaire suggested that it was advisable for writers to live in close proximity to a frontier, so that if necessary, they could hop across it into safety. Frontiers will not defend a writer now. Not if this new form of terrorism, terrorism by remote control, terrorism by edict and bounty, is allowed to have its day. This form of terrorism is an exercise of power, and religious persecution is never a matter of morality and always an exercise of power. To defeat these modern-day witch burners, it is necessary to show them that our power, too, is great. It is necessary to show them that our numbers are greater than theirs, and that our resolve, too, is greater than theirs. This is a battle of wills. The Satanic Verses was published in the United States soon after the Fatwa in early 1989. That's just about 3 years ago. During that period, its publishers and booksellers have been subjected to enormous, very menacing pressures, and they have stood firm. At times they have wobbled a little, as who would not, as I myself certainly have from time to time. But the book has been kept in print. It is in print today. And for that act of principle and courage, I thank its Viking Penguin and all the other publishers around the world. I thank American booksellers, all the individual men and women who have participated in this. In difficult circumstances, what needed to be done was done. But we didn't finish the job. We did not complete the cycle of publication. We did not publish a paperback edition. In the first 2 years after the hardback was published, I had a number of conversations with the senior executives of Penguin Books, even a few rather absurdly arranged cloak and dagger meetings of the type that Mike Wallace will remember. I told them at those meetings that in my opinion it was absolutely necessary to publish a paperback, not only in order to demonstrate that we had not yielded to threats, but because the most normal thing to do was in fact also the safest thing. Not to publish was to show fear, and to show fear was to invite further attacks. Penguin Books took a different position. They continued to support the idea of paperback publication when the time was right. But in those tense times, they could never agree that the time was right. Please understand, I do not blame them for taking a different view from mine. They had their considerations, including the safety of their staff. I had mine. There followed a period in which, for reasons I've gone into before, I also agreed to suspend the paperback edition in the hope that the space created would make possible explanations and reconciliations. This was a mistake, and it didn't happen. Finally, recognizing the mistake, I said at Columbia University last winter that the paperback had waited long enough and should be published. You may ask, why bother? Why not forget about it? So let me just quickly restate the reasons. First, there can be no question that the Satanic Verses would have been published in paperback, probably about a year after its original hardback publication, had it not been for the threats aimed against it. Non-publication would therefore be a great defeat for freedom of expression. It would demonstrate that violence is capable of determining, in present-day America and Britain and the rest of the English language market, what books can be published and in what form. We have done so much to withstand the pressure. We cannot and we must not fall at the final hurdle. Second, the way publishing is now constituted in the English language countries, paperback publication is simply the only way of guaranteeing long-term availability. It is already the case that a hardcover copy of the Satanic Verses can be very hard to find in your local bookstore. In a few years it will disappear altogether. And then, in effect, the book will have been banned. And everything that has been done and suffered will have been done and suffered for nothing. What a defeat that would be. Third, the Satanic Verses is a book that has been very largely condemned unread. It remains my view that the text itself is the best defense. That the majority of fair-minded readers, given the chance to read it, would find that the charges leveled against it are utterly and maliciously false. I want that text available to as wide a readership as possible. The attacks on it, after all, have been trumpeted to an incredibly wide audience all around the world. I don't have the ability to shout as loud as that, but I can try and make sure that people are not excluded from making up their own minds about the book because they can't afford the cost of a hardback novel. Students must read the Satanic Verses, if only because, for the very worst of reasons, it has become an important text. Scholars must read it, and young Muslims and atheists and lovers of literature. Lovers of literature, perhaps above all. Finally, this is a somewhat personal, perhaps emotional viewpoint. I am proud of my book. Like a parent, I am appalled by what has been said about my child. I can't help feeling that if you were to get to know it, you might like it better. and also that to leave the paperback unpublished would be to accept, in some degree, that it is indeed a bad child that should be consigned to some sort of limbo. To leave the paperback unpublished would be to pass a guilty verdict on an innocent book. There is something I want to say about this question of the paperback tonight. After my visit to Columbia, I had one last meeting with Penguin Books at a location in England. At that meeting, I was told that they felt unable to agree to my request to publish a paperback edition. Indeed, they said they could see no moment in the future when they would be able to publish. It was a friendly and sorrowful meeting. I thanked them for their continuing support of the hardback edition and said that in the light of what they had told me, I had no alternative but to ask them to return the English language paperback rights in the book. And this they did. Since that time, many people have been looking into the ways and means of completing, with great difficulty, what ought never to have been a difficult task. That work has now borne fruit. So, it is a great delight to have the opportunity of making this announcement before an audience which will, I am sure, appreciate its importance. It has been a long road, and a road beset with problems, but I am now able to speak a sentence which I often thought would never be spoken. Today, ladies and gentlemen, is the publication day of the paperback of the Satanic Verses. It is rather an emotional moment. There it is. A lot of people have worked very hard to make this possible. They've given their advice and their time and their skills, and mostly free of charge. And alas, the best thing I'm able to do for them at the moment is to leave them unnamed. But they know who they are, and I thank them for it. And I hope that once this book is in the shops and people can see that there it is and nobody's rushing in to do terrible things to people, people may be willing to own up to the fact that they helped bring this book into being. I hope that will happen. That was worth crossing the Atlantic for. But there are actually other reasons. And I wouldn't like simply to end on that, because I'm also here to suggest to you, and beyond you, to the people in this town who run the world, that this matter is not simply a foreign issue in which American interests and the principles upon which the United States has been built are not involved. I believe they are involved, and I would like to suggest that those interests and principles have already been gravely threatened by what has happened, and failing a solution will undoubtedly be threatened further. free society is by its nature a divided society. It is argumentative, multiple, plural, quarrelsome. Societies in motion, free societies are societies in motion, and with motion comes tension and friction. Free peoples strike sparks, and those sparks are the best evidence of the existence of freedom. Totalitarian societies, by contrast, seek to halt the motion of society, to snuff out the sparks. The primary purpose of unfreedom is always to shackle the mind. Now, the creative process, is actually quite like the process of a free society. That's to say, within the artist's mind, many attitudes, many views of the world jostle and conflict and strike sparks, and it is out of that multiplicity that the work of art is born. Now, this multiplicity has often been very difficult for artists to bear, let alone to explain. Denis Diderot spoke of the dispute within him between atheistic materialist rationalism and his profound need for spiritual and moral depth. He said, "It infuriates me to be enmeshed in a devilish philosophy which my mind is forced to accept but my heart to disown." Dostoevsky also agonized about the coexistence in his heart of absolute faith and absolute unbelief. And Milton, you remember, was described by Blake, Milton, that devout genius, who Blake thought was better at describing hell than heaven in Paradise Lost, was described by Blake as being, because he was a poet, naturally of the devil's party. Within every artist, perhaps within every human imagination, there exists, to paraphrase Blake, a marriage between heaven and hell. Satanic Verses is a novel about that marriage, about the conflicts and tensions between but also within the religious and the secular view of the world. It is the profoundly ironic fate of this novel and of its author to be engulfed by exactly the war of realities that it seeks to describe and to comprehend. I want to come to a difficult point, which is, why am I in America talking about this? I would say this: the Satanic Verses was and is an American publication. The principal contract for the book was signed in New York. The attack on it, therefore, was and is an attack not only on my right to write freely, but also on the right of an American publisher to publish freely, and perhaps most important of all, on the rights of American readers to decide what they want to read, because censorship is also an assault on readers. As has been suggested even before the Fatwa, the United States Information Service building in Pakistan was attacked, the United States has been at the center of this affair from the beginning. On the 21st of February 1989, President Bush said, "Inciting murder and offering rewards for its perpetration are deeply offensive to the norm of civilized behavior." 2 days later, a letter from members of the House of Representatives respectfully requested the President, quotes, "that the government of Iran be put on public notice that it is the United States' intention to postpone indefinitely any possibility of normalized trade or diplomatic relations until the threats have been rescinded and the safety of the author, publishers, and sellers of the Satanic Verses has been assured." That safety, ladies and gentlemen, has not yet been assured. American publishers and sellers have been menaced. You know about the beginning, bookshops and newspaper in the Bronx, bookshops in California, newspaper in the Bronx were firebombed. The protests have, of course, continued. U.S. Ambassador Nicholas Veliotti is the president of the Association of American Publishers, testified at a special hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that, quotes, "any real concession to terrorists begets more terrorism." Meanwhile, the threats have continued. The bounty money has been increased several times. British intelligence has had reports of death squads financed directly by the Iranian government. The Italian translator has been knifed, the Japanese translator murdered. The fatwa is being implemented. The British government now says, now that the British hostages are all free, the British government now says that this matter is at the top of its agenda. and that relations with Iran will not be normalized until a satisfactory solution has been reached. 115 members of the European Parliament, that's a large majority, have passed a strong resolution condemning the threats. There are increasingly loud demands throughout Europe that this matter be speedily resolved. The US government's voice would add immeasurably to the weight of those demands. Just to deal with one or two objections. It is regularly suggested by Iranian politicians that the fatwa is irreversible, that the problem is therefore incapable of solution. This is untrue. Fatwas have been reversed fairly regularly. But let's start one step back from that. For a start, the offers of money for people's assassination are quite plainly secular matters. In this case, the Iranian government can't even attempt to hide behind its theological smokescreen. These so-called bounty offers must be publicly, effectively, and accountably repudiated by Iran. International law is also a matter for governments. Iran's attempt to export this most lethal aspect of its revolution beyond its own jurisdiction is also a matter in which no theological considerations apply. Iran has repeatedly stated its respect for international law and its wish to adhere to such law. It is time for this respect and this desire to be demonstrated. But even according to Islamic theology, there are certainly ways for fatwas to be cancelled. There's one vivid example in the Khomeini period, an extremely unpopular fatwa that was passed banning all cigarette smoking and tobacco products. That only lasted a year. The Grand Ayatollahs have the power to cancel the fatwa, and they must be encouraged to do so. Iran's own constitution contains an interesting legal principle, for which the name is maslahat, which translates roughly as self-interest. A principle which was put there by Imam Khomeini himself. And according to it, any Iranian laws, including laws based on Quranic texts, can be abrogated if they run counter to the national interest of Iran. The point then is to demonstrate to Iran that the fatwa does indeed run counter to Iranian interests, and must therefore, like any law, and the point to mention is that since Khomeini's status in Iran was that of lawgiver, his fatwas were simply laws. So like any law, the fatwa can be repealed. It is also, as many learned Islamic jurists have pointed out, illegal according to Islamic law. Now, of course, I neither live under nor accept Islamic law, but the Iranian authorities do. Example, Imam Khomeini was a Shia. My background is Sunni Muslim. He should therefore have no jurisdiction over me. Again, he lived in the Islamic world, the so-called House of Islam, while I do not. Islamic law disqualifies itself from any authority outside the House of Islam. Again, the condemnation was made without any attempt to study the text, without any pretense at due process of law, and it is therefore, by Islamic standards, invalid. I mean, I'm here to say what you would expect me to say. The case of the Iranian fatwa against the Satanic Verses must be closed. It affects American business interests, the safety of American citizens, the principles of freedom embodied in the American Constitution. Now, a paperback edition of the book has finally been published in part to uphold the principles enshrined in the First Amendment. It is more than ever imperative that the United States, in concert with Britain and Europe and other countries, act to defend those who have had the courage to complete this much menaced publication. Terrorist techniques become popular when they're seen to be working. Airplane hijacking, the taking of hostages, became a custom when it seemed to be bearing political fruit. It ceased when it seemed not to be bearing fruit. If this new form of terror, this what I call remote control terrorism by edict and bounty, is not defeated now, any nation, any organization with the resources to do so can and will repeat the exercise. Today it's me, tomorrow it could be you. So there's another reason. Those are, well, let's say, the American reasons for asking America to come on board, but I think there are others for asking the United States to come on board. One is to demonstrate to the government of Iran and to many other nations, particularly Muslim nations, in which writers are still being harassed and tortured and killed with depressing regularity, that the United States will not turn a blind eye to such behavior. Britain, Europe, the United States all say these days that human rights will be an issue in their relationships with the rest of the world. Well, here's an opportunity, to put their money where their mouth is. Finally, however, the point about asking the United States to help is quite straightforwardly and unidealistically because the United States is able to help. Because these days the power and influence of the United States is so great that it can be of absolute and invaluable assistance in a struggle in which the friends of freedom cannot contemplate defeat. So I appeal to the American government to show itself to be the true friend of liberty in a world in which that high ideal has acquired of late many powerful enemies. Thank you.
I'm Scott Armstrong, and I'm responsible for many of the minor indignities you were forced to suffer tonight to get here. A small portion of those that Salman suffers on a daily basis. Salman has agreed to take some questions. I'm going to be up here to be a timekeeper, and at an arbitrary point, I'll be rude to you, and he'll depart us. Can I have the first question? Mike, this is your prerogative.
Salman, what would you like the United States government, either the White House or the Congress, to do?
Well, I suggested just now a few of the things that I felt that they might be able to consider, but well, the truth is that that's precisely a question that one of the reasons for crossing the Atlantic and coming particularly to Washington was that I had hoped to be able to discuss that question with various members of the Senate and of the House of Representatives in particular. But for reasons that, frankly, I'm not clear about, that meeting has not taken place and has been cancelled.
Was there a meeting scheduled?
Yes, there was. Yes, there was, and I was informed that it would not take place, and I don't know why. So it's difficult to explain.
Scheduled for when?
Well, let's say during my visit.
And Laura, could you identify yourself as you rise? If you'd like.
A newspaper. Now on leave in the United States, visiting professor at the University of Minnesota. Mr. Rushdie, it goes without saying that we admire your courage. We admire your fight for freedom of speech, freedom of the human being. But at the same time, I would like to say one thing. I came from the country where thousands of writers, artists, scientists were killed, shot, arrested, exiled, tortured. Nobody defended them. There were no detective forces shielding them. There were no President of the United States and Congress helping them. They didn't publish their books because books were killed as the authors were killed. Here, even in this room, are representatives of the journalistic forces of South Africa, Chile, Salvador, Russia again, who just came from prisons. They don't compare themselves with Galileo, with Socrates. They don't compare themselves with Jesus Christ.
Is that what I did?
But, but at the same time, they are unsung heroes of the noble fight for freedom of the press, freedom of speech. You dedicated your speech almost entirely to your case, to your book, You told us that today the paperback publication of your book is already launched. We are very happy about it. We congratulate you. But please, take into account that you are not alone in this fight, that you are not the maybe utmost case. Because if we compare Stalin with Khomeini, Khomeini looks very small, very insignificant. If we compare Khomeini with other
Mallory, you have to finish your
dictators,
question here. I'll
they
have
are
to answer this
nothing.
next trip.
My question is, please be one of us.
Well, I think it's, thank you for your, there was, I suppose, a question mark at the end of that. Thank you for your question. I find it extraordinary to have to defend myself in this situation. I've spent my life, a great deal of my life as a writer, protesting about the conditions of writers in other countries, sir. You know, and I think perhaps anybody who knows about that would know that. I'm not trying to compare myself to Galileo and Socrates and Christ. I'm trying to point out that when people are attacked for blasphemy, so were the greatest figures in European Western history. I'm not trying to. I mean, why is that? Is that an inadmissible statement, in your view? Is that incorrect? No. All right. Of course, many people are worse off than me. I tried to mention in the speech a reason why I wanted people's support was to say this is simply the most visible case in the Islamic world. I'm sorry. It is. I don't think many people would deny that. I tried to point out that Iran has been killing its writers for years. I've pointed out to journalists for the last 2 days, more or less non-stop, that even in moderate Islamic countries like Egypt, writers are being rounded up in jail for terrible sentences at the moment. So, I mean, I'm sorry, I don't defend myself for making my own case. Maybe you've never heard of what I've said before, sir, but perhaps you should find out.
Do we have a translator from Sicily?
Je voudrais demander à M. Sanford de bien vouloir traduire pour moi. Votre livre, Les versets sataniques, est interdit dans mon pays, le Sénégal, comme dans plusieurs pays musulmans.
Your book, Satanic Verses, is forbidden in my country of Senegal, as it is in many other countries.
Ceci pour éviter les troubles qu'auraient occasionné les manifestations des fondamentalistes musulmans.
The reason was to avoid the trouble that would have been caused by fundamentalist demonstrations.
C'est dire donc que votre ouvrage est considéré comme une menace dans certains pays.
Therefore, your work is considered as a threat in many countries.
Cela dit, je voudrais vous poser deux questions. La première, que répondez-vous à ceux qui pensent que la liberté d'expression ne doit pas être confondue avec le blasphème et l'injure? Ça, c'est la première question.
So I'd like to pose two questions to you. The first is, what do you say to people who think that liberty of freedom of expression ought not to be confused with blasphemy?
Deuxième question, ne regrettez-vous pas d'avoir écrit ce roman dont la publication a conduit à l'appel à votre meurtre, appel que je condamne?
I'm sorry, Abdullah, could you repeat
He
this?
says,
Regrettez-vous
do I regret publishing a
d'avoir
book which
écrit-
has led to a condemnation to death? Well, the question of blasphemy is the first question. I mean, as I tried to say, and I'll say it again, the accusation of blasphemy is always the accusation used in totalitarian religious states to prevent new ideas. I mean, it's well known that the Egyptian writer Mahfouz, the winner of the Nobel Prize, was accused of blasphemy. It's well known that within the last decade, groups of prominent Saudi clerics have declared the entire project of modernism as being blasphemous. And that any writer with modernistic tendencies has been accused of blasphemy. In this country, I think there's an excellent principle, which is that there is no such law as a law against blasphemy. I would support the abolition of such laws everywhere in the world. That's the question. Second question was, do I regret writing the book because of what happened to it? Well, I certainly regret a great deal of what's happened. I mean, I much prefer, as I said, not to have to live in this very bizarre situation. But it's impossible to regret a book unless one disavows the ideas in it, and I do not do that. Sorry, nobody's translating for the gentleman, so he doesn't understand the answer. He does. Oh, he does. Sorry. Oh, good. Right. Well, I mean, the answer is, I think, that inside this book is the answer to your question. You know, I do not believe there to be in this book any insult or offense. The people, the demonstrations that happened, the bannings that happened, in every instance, happened before the book had ever entered the country. The book was banned in India before any copy of it had ever reached India. It was banned unread. The book was banned in South Africa, and I will be willing to bet a large sum of money in Senegal, before anybody had read it to make a determination about what was in it. I find it difficult to accept the blame for the banning of a book that was banned without it having been perused.
Yeah.
Daniel Shaw of National Public Radio. Mr. Rushdie, can you say a little more about why you feel less than completely secure with British protection, and whether you're considering then living in some other country, perhaps this one?
No, I'm not considering living in any other country. I'm a British citizen and I intend to live in Britain. The problem is that I mentioned earlier that there is a kind of conservative polemic against the protection that takes place in England, and I think that's beginning to have an effect on the authorities responsible for the protection. That's to say, there's a sense in which, I mean, as the gentleman over there pointed out, I was actually told by a policeman the other day that plenty of people live in England in danger and some of them get killed. It didn't strike me as a reason for ceasing to protect somebody who might get killed, but there we are. There is a problem. I think there is a lack or a diminishing will to continue with this. I don't think anybody ever expected this to go on such a long time.
Is it political?
I don't know. I don't know. Well, we'll find out, won't we, at the general election.
Jerry?
Terrence Smith, CBS News. Mr. Rushdie, let me pursue this matter of the canceled meeting and therefore American policy. Within the limits of your security, can you tell us with whom you were going to meet? And what reason, if any, was given for the cancellation of the meeting? And finally, whether there is any recourse or approach to the White House?
Well, I have actually, perhaps I should ask Scott, do you want to talk about that? I mean, I'm not exactly sure who there was that I was going to meet. I mean, I know one or two names, and I mean, I don't know whether I should mention them. I have not been given any convincing reason for the cancellation. I'm sorry? Legislators. Legislators of both houses, but...
Jerry?
Jerry Freedom, the Freedom Forum. I was going to ask a similar sort of question. Maybe Scott can help us on it. Was a meeting requested with the executive branch members in the United States, as Terry is suggesting, someone other than the Congress, and if so, was that also canceled?
As I understand it, the meeting was going to be with members of the Senate and the House of Representatives. That's what I understand. And the cancellation was very abrupt, and I have not had a satisfactory reason for it.
Kathy Gay?
Kathy Gay.
Here, take a microphone.
If you had it to do over again, sort of a follow-up to the other question,
yeah.
Would you do it differently? How would you do it?
I don't know. You know, it's very difficult for me. When I began writing the Satanic Verses, it was 9 years ago. When I finished writing the Satanic Verses, it was 4 years ago. That's to say, I am already substantially different as a writer from the person who wrote the book. If I were to settle down to treat that subject now, I would clearly write it differently. If I was to write any one of my novels now, I wouldn't write it the same way. I would not write Midnight's Children the same way now. I have to say that I would like to think, I mean, if you're asking the impossible question, that if I'd known then what would happen, would I have done it, you know? And I would like to be able to say, yes, sure, I'd have written it exactly the same way, every sentence and so forth, because, I mean, that's, as it were, the correct answer. The real answer is I really don't know. I suspect I might not have been quite as heroic as that.
Joe Schumann, journalism student at American University. Mr. Rushdie, how has your creative process, your writing, been affected by the Fatwa and your ordeal? Can you still create?
Yeah, it's more difficult. I mean, simply because the time available is polluted by having to constantly think about things I shouldn't have to think about, like this affair. I mean, I have managed to continue writing. I published Haroon and the Sea of Stories. I published a volume of essays, Imagining Homelands, and you know, for me, to publish 2 books in 3 years is a kind of world's record, because I'm usually a lot slower than that. So I have managed to go on. I mean, I think there's no doubt that it's true to say that the task of beginning a major novel has been harder. And I mean, I am now finally trying to begin one, but I don't know. I think it'll probably take a longer time. So I slowed down even more, I'm afraid.
First,
Gautam Adhikari, The Times of India, Bombay. First, I think I should make one correction. The Midnight's Children, Mr. Wallace, was not banned in India, I think.
Yeah.
But did you find it especially ironic that the first country to ban your book was a non-Islamic one, and the country that you were born in?
Yes, I do. I've always found that one of the saddest things, that it began in India. I also find it very sad the way it began in India. I mean, what happened was that one journalist in India Today wrote one article which was based on an interview with me, which added to it, and added to this article were several, 2 or 3 quotes from the novel, which were chosen for maximum impact, let's say. And on the basis of that one article, a couple of Muslim MPs the next day made a stink about the novel, threatened the then very wobbly Rajiv Gandhi government with all sorts of public disorder. And the government chickened out and banned the book without even bothering to acquire a copy. I mean, I thought that was very sad, and I did say so in open letters to the Prime Minister at the time. All I can hope is that if India was the place where it began, it might also be the place where it begins to end. It would be nice for India to be the first country in the world to lift the ban on the Satanic Verses.
Cameron?
I am Kamran Khan. I have come from Pakistan. From your address, it seems that you feel danger to your security from Iran only. I've come from Pakistan, and I believe there are dozens of people who definitely have not read the novel, want to get you and kill you. And that's not stand correct for Pakistan. I believe there are lots of people in Bangladesh and in India.
Yeah.
How can you expect security from the United States, from all of those people in all those countries? I don't think that's only the problem from Iran.
Well, thanks for the information. There is a difference, you see, between what you're talking about and what I'm talking about. There's no question that there are plenty of individuals who, for various reasons, if they were to come across me, might not wish to shake me by the hand. There's a difference between that and the issue of state-sponsored professional terrorists. I don't think anybody could reasonably expect the British government or any other government, in concert with the British government, to persuade all the people in the world who don't like me that they should like me a lot. I don't think that's a political process. I do think it's legitimate to ask the governments of the free world to say that if they wish to do business with and to readmit into world society a government such as Iran, that they can make a precondition of that government ceases to finance international terrorism. I mean, the point is that if you're asking me whether I can look out for the odd hooligan who might decide to have a go at me, I'm prepared to take that on. What I'm not able to take on is dealing personally as a private citizen with the issue of international terrorism.
Anton Harbour from the Weekly Mail in Johannesburg, a newspaper that invited you to South Africa a month after you published the book.
Yeah.
You were unfortunately unable to come, but before I ask my question, I'd like to say that it's an invitation we'd like to renew. As soon as you find it convenient, we'd be happy to host your visit there.
Thank you.
My question is, what is your attitude now to the religion, Islam?
Well, I mean, all right, let me answer this straightforwardly. when I wrote the Satanic Verses, I was actually quite sympathetic towards it. I mean, I think one of the great ironies about this is that the Satanic Verses is a novel, almost all of whose major characters are British or Indian Muslims. Not all of whom are portrayed as wonderful people, but I mean, but there's a, they're portrayed as human beings, and the world of the book is portrayed from that point of view. I have to say that after 3 years of having my life smashed apart by the forces of religion, I'm perhaps slightly less well disposed towards it.
Harding Carter, you have detailed the hiccuping of politicians and governments and the on-again, off-again willingness of the publishing industry to put its mouth where its principles say they are. I'm interested in what the reaction has been individually and organizationally by journalists and writers, and whether that has been particularized by, let us say, within the West, whether within the West it has been subdivided as well. Has there been uniform support or what?
Well, I mean, nothing is ever 100%. I think, you know, there have certainly been writers who have not been supportive, but I mean, I do think that if one's looking at kind of communities of support, that the support from writers and intellectuals around the world has and journalists, you know, has probably been the most consistent and the most consistently positive of any group that one can think of. You know, so while there have been some exceptions that that there's in a way no point in naming, the great majority of people have been instinctively supportive.
Sustained.
Oh, sustained. Well, yeah, I mean, you know, again, it's always possible to say I wish people had done more. You know, I mean, but actually, writers' organizations, civil rights organizations, human rights organizations have probably been more consistent, more sustained at keeping this case in front of the world's attention than any other groups. I mean, certainly more than political parties, for example.
Eric Nalder, I'm with the Seattle Times. I'd like to pursue a couple of questions. One that was asked earlier, and still don't have it clear whether you've talked with anybody at the White House or the U.S. State Department to intervene for your help, and also whether or not you've found any means, perhaps through intermediaries or something like that, to communicate with the government of Iran itself. The U.S. government seemed to be able to do that during the worst of times, and I wondered if you had done that.
Well, I mean, as regards the White House and the State Department, no, I've had no contacts directly with them. As regards Iran, I mean, no, I'm not in close personal touch. But there were some interesting developments. I mean, for example, in London on the day of the 3rd anniversary of the Fatwa, there was suddenly an invitation from the Iranian mission in London to Francis de Souza of Article 19, who runs the Defense Committee there, to come and meet. I mean, this was after a long period in which they'd refused to answer telephone calls or letters. Suddenly, on that day, when there was a great series of demonstrations in London, they had a meeting. Now, I mean, the meeting wasn't exactly, let's say, a meeting of minds, but I mean, on the other hand, the fact that it occurred was significant, because in the previous 3 years, all attempts to make such contacts were very straightforwardly rebuffed. As regards the contacts through the British government, they clearly are taking place. I mean, I'm occasionally given some information as to what kind of conversations are being had, and I mean, I would hope that they'll bear fruit. I mean, I think the fact is that the political pressure that has been building around this case since the freeing of the last of the hostages has stiffened the resolve of the British government somehow. I mean, to some degree, and one has to hope that that will bear fruit. I mean, I think we are now down to an issue of political negotiation, really, and the question is how tough the British, with the European and American support, will be in making sure that the threats are removed.
Salman, the photographers want you to hold up the book for a minute.
Oh, yeah.
Right here. Right here. Right there.
Okay.
Miranda Cousins of Ukraine. First of all, I want to congratulate you with the issue of your paperback.
Thank you.
And then I want to ask you a question. If you're considering any possibility to print your book outside of the US, in the countries where it is not banned, for example, in the Soviet Union.
Oh, well, I don't know. I didn't think there was anywhere called the Soviet Union.
I ask you to print it in Ukraine.
Well, I mean, I believe that there is an illegal pirated edition in Russia. I haven't seen it, but I'm told that it's there. I have no idea what the quality of the translation is. As regards the other countries, I mean, I'm open to offers. It would be very nice if publishers would do it. I'm in favor of that.
Victor Navasky from The Nation over here. How are you? I have a three-part question. The students of the publishing industry have been alarmed, as you know, at the concentration, conglomeratization of the transnational publishing community, and I wonder first whether that has affected in a positive or negative way your situation. Second, I'm curious whether Viking Penguin, if you can say, you may not be able to as part of the consortium. And third, when the rights were turned over to you, a technical question, did they turn over the mass market paperback rights? And if so, would you be amenable to an arrangement whereby the Freedom Forum or some other publicly minded, First Amendment-oriented entity published the mass market paperback and took the publisher's share and dedicated it to promoting some of the ideas that have been discussed for 3 days here and that you've been talking about this evening?
Oh, right. Well, I mean, that's... I'm happy to... I mean, thank you, Victor. I mean, I think the correct answer to that is talk to my agent. But, but in principle, of course, what Penguin did was to revert to me world English language paperback rights. So, I mean, in that sense, I have them all. However, I should say that this organization, the Consortium Inc., is the consortium to which I have given those paperback rights. So any other form of publication would have to be also by negotiation with them. As regards whether Penguin are a member of the consortium or not, well, I think you should probably ask them, but I wouldn't hold your breath.
The first part of the conglomerated publishing community, has that helped or hurt you?
Oh, I don't know. I think you could argue that both ways. You know? I mean, I think there's no doubt that the fact that Penguin were a very large and powerful international company certainly helped them withstand the weight of the attack that came against them. I think, many times I believe that if it had been a sort of small independent publishing company that had faced that kind of assault, they might well not have been able to, might well not have had the resources to deal with that. So I think that's, if you like, in favor. I mean, on the other side, I think it's possible to argue that, for example, the issue of the paperback was really a political issue in Britain to a much greater extent than in the United States. And yet, the fact that its publisher, the owner of World English Language Rights, was a publisher in both markets, made them reluctant to publish the paperback anywhere in the world because of the problem in the United Kingdom. So there, in a sense, the American paperback publication was, if you like, delayed because of a problem in another country. So, I mean, I think there's been an advantage and a disadvantage. So, I don't know, it's a draw, I guess.
Mr. Rushdie, Dale Solly with WJLA-TV here in Washington. I don't know that many of us could really understand what it's like to live on a day-to-day basis in hiding with a total lack of freedom. What is your life like now after 3 years underground on a day-to-day basis? And is there anything that you hate because of that?
Well, right now it's the question of what my life is like. I mean, right this moment it's getting a bit better. I mean, this is a lot more people than I usually hang out with. And I mean, it's certainly my plan to do this a whole lot more. Really. I mean, I do think, no, I mean, to be serious, I do think there comes a time when you can't go on living in a box, and I've said that before, and I say it again, and I am going to do what I can to reclaim ordinary speech, ordinary life. but I mean, but being sensible about it. I mean, having been this careful for this long, I don't particularly want to go and stand in Trafalgar Square and wave a flag. It's been very difficult. What can I tell you? It's been very difficult. I mean, if you'd asked me 3 years ago whether I'd have either cracked up by now, I would have said, well, probably I would. Somehow I have not cracked up. I'm unable to tell you. Perhaps you think I have. But it feels all right from here. And well, stop there.
Salman, most unexpected.
Introduce yourself, Bob.
Sorry. My name is Robert Cox. I'm now with the Post and Courier in Charleston. Most unexpected, but very, very welcome visitor. My closest friend is Andrew Graham Ewald, who's the editor of Index on Censorship. And he explained to me that when he heard that you were in trouble, he phoned you up and said, wouldn't you like to stay with us in Golders Green until the trouble passes over?
Yes.
The reason I bring this up is that Andrew's used to that. He left out Argentina sometime before I did, and he wasn't killed because he left Argentina. I think perhaps it will help people here to understand your situation in the kind of things that happened in Argentina. The enormity of somebody being killed or threatened immediately suggested that they'd done something that was enormously wrong. And that seemed to many people to justify it. If somebody was dead, they deserved to be dead. If somebody was threatened with death, they must have done something terrible. It seems to me that you've only written a book. Have you done something else that is terrible?
No.
That's what they asked him in Argentina.
No, I think, thank you. I think that's true, and I think that connects back. I mean, if we look at history and you look at the burnings of heretics and the drownings of witches, I mean, large crowds would gather and would say, oh yeah, terrible people, glad to get rid of them. And it is, unfortunately, one of the problems of persecution. It's like having nasty things written about you in the papers. People believe them. Only it's a rather more extreme form of that. No, I mean, I just wrote this book. And I mean, it's very difficult to say this because the Satanic Verses, I mean, I don't know, I won't embarrass you by asking for a show of hands, but I suspect relatively few people in this room have read the book. Many, so rather more of you may own a copy. But there is a problem about this book, which is that it's been described. That's to say, the power to describe it has fallen into the hands of its enemies. I notice when articles are written about this issue in the British newspapers, they are written by religious affairs correspondents. How have I fallen into the hands of religious affairs correspondents? I mean, whatever happened to literary editors? And book critics, I didn't like them, but suddenly I'm a religious affair. And there's a problem here, which is that people say that this is I mean, if you had to ask somebody in this room, which again I won't embarrass them by doing, to sort of characterize the Satanic Verses in about 20 or 30 words, I suspect people would think of it as very serious, heavyweight, rather arcane theological dispute with a religion that nobody knows anything about anyway, from somewhere else, written by somebody from somewhere else. So what's it got to do with us? Now, what's very difficult to tell people is that actually it's a comic novel. That the entire purpose of everything I've written, the entire sort of drive of my work is comic and satirical. That it's a story in which those contentious passages are heavily ironized, heavily distanced from any authorial position and occupy a relatively small section of the text and actually are not what the novel is about. Now, it's very hard when a book has been so extensively falsified by such powerful voices in so many countries to keep on saying, well, actually, it's not like that. It's a different book. I didn't write that book, because people assume that why would, somebody stand up in every pulpit of every mosque in every country of the world where there are mosques, which is every country, and say a certain thing about a book if it were not so? Well, the fact is, it is not so. They are wrong about the book. The kind of fictitious, demonized Satanic Verses that exists in the popular mind is no more the book that I wrote than I am the fictitious, demonized person whose effigy is burnt in the public square. So it's very hard except to keep saying, that isn't me. This is me.
Salman, thank you. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry if I was rude to anyone. It's more my eyesight than rudeness, but you chalk it off either way. Salman had to leave to get his suit pressed. As you can see, he's been spending too much time on planes recently. The answer to the earlier question regarding meetings was that there was a meeting intended for tomorrow on Capitol Hill. There was some pressure from the leadership to cancel that meeting. We don't know where that came from, other than the indication was it came from the administration. I would hope that we would have more information for you at some time in the near future. As you can imagine, Salman is not able to stay in any one place for long, and as a result, he'll be departing very shortly. I regret that we may not be able to reschedule that meeting because these things take weeks and weeks and months. Having entered into his bubble for 1 week, I can only imagine what it must be like to live there for years and years and years. I think it's clear to all of us that in the very direct way that free expression must remain free, that Salman is us and we are Salman. Whether or not we agree with what he's written, we have to appreciate what's happened to him for what he's written. I thank you for coming.
Scott, I'm sorry. You confused me completely. You say the pressure came from the leadership. I presume you mean the Democratic leadership. And then in the same sentence, you said the administration. I'm John Henry.
I don't know a lot more. We'll try and get you more information tomorrow. I'm not in a position. We do not have enough information at this point.
Were you speaking of the Democratic leadership?
Yes.
When you said the leadership?
Yes. That
and
was
when
the
you
hope
said the administration, you meant the White House?
That's correct. Let's have this discussion later. I want to turn the forum back to, in this particular matter, to Chris Wells.
I'm Chris Wells, Vice President of International Operations for the Freedom Forum. This has been a very, very important evening. An important evening for all of us who have shared this commitment to free expression and free speech. We at the Freedom Forum are especially pleased to have been able to bring Salman Rushdie here tonight to speak to us, because he is a symbol of what we at the Freedom Forum support. That is the fundamental belief in free press, free speech, and free spirit. Our work at the Freedom Forum is to foster those beliefs, and we know that because of evenings like this, freedom works. And we thank you for sharing this evening with us. May I please now invite you to join us for a reception outside this room and also upstairs on the 23rd floor so we can continue to express ourselves. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for my help, Chris. For some reason, I thought your name was Carla Bird for a second. I don't even know her Carla Bird. No, I just good job.
Experts and the public at large to advance the mission of freedom. This involves conferences, seminars, publications, and promotion across the USA and around the world. The Freedom Forum tonight is especially pleased to join with American University in sponsoring this international conference on free expression and global media. I'm pleased tonight to be able to introduce someone who seems to get almost as much on-the-air TV time as Mike Wallace. For all of you C-SPAN watchers, and who of us is not one, you know that Sandy Unger is on his way to becoming a household word and face. As Dean of the School of Communications at American University, Sandy is the moderator of frequent forums sponsored by American University, frequently carried on C-SPAN. He's not only an educator, he's a bona fide journalist. I'm pleased to introduce him now. Welcome, Sandy Unger.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to the Freedom Forum for joining us in this very exciting endeavor. For several days now, we've been talking about freedom of expression around the world. We've been joined by courageous journalists from 39 countries, by heroes and heroines that we can all salute and feel honored to be in their company.
Countries, 66 publications or broadcasters were banned, and 27 editorial offices were raided. But while violence against us has taken a high toll, we keep coming back to pursue the story, and by our own collective persistence, we keep the pressure on. So those powerful forces who would intimidate us become the focus of even more intense scrutiny. But there are instances when even collective action may not be enough. Those in control of an entire nation state have singled out individual reporters as they have hunted, found, and extinguished them. One example. 42 years ago, CBS correspondent George Polk shot in the head in the course of his reporting on the Greek junta. In the 4 decades since, the violence has not only not subsided, but it has reached across borders and come to us here in America. Last month, in my hometown, New York City, the crusading editor-in-chief of El Diario, Manuel de Dios, was murdered, apparently by the drug lords who have done their best to dominate the politics of several Latin countries. This was the 3rd killing of a journalist covering international affairs on U.S. soil in the past 15 months. In 1991, Haitian radio talk show hosts Fritz Dor and Jean-Claude Olivier. When a powerful force, whether an individual or a corporation, or even an entire nation, sets out deliberately to stop an individual writer or a journalist, all writers, all journalists have to respond to the challenge. And when a powerful force sets out to intimidate a single publisher or a single broadcast organization, all publishers, all broadcasters must be ready to respond. As journalists, we are all of us familiar with the high and sometimes even fatal cost of sharing our information and ideas with the public. In the past half-century, thousands of our peers have been wounded, some of them killed, while trying to report information from around the world. The statistics are stunning. Last year alone, 66 foreign correspondents and local journalists were killed, the highest number recorded by the Committee to Protect Journalists since its beginning back in 1981. The first 7 months of the Yugoslav conflict alone saw 19 journalists killed, plus 2 more missing and presumed dead, the highest rate in modern warfare. In 1991, in over 100 countries, 324 journalists were detained, 156 attacked physically, 42 expelled from
Good evening. I am Charles Overby, President and CEO of the Freedom Forum, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you here tonight. The Freedom Forum is dedicated to using its resources to promoting free press, free speech, and free spirit. We're the largest organization in the world that has these freedoms as its primary mission. We're independent politically and financially. We don't raise money. We're here for the long haul. I hope you'll enjoy these facilities tonight. They were built to be the center of activities for the next 40 years. Public opinion about free press and free speech and free spirit may rise and fall, but these facilities will be here to stand as a beacon for freedom in good times and in bad times well into the 21st century. The Freedom Forum is what its name implies, a forum for freedom. We work with media experts.
We're also honored to be in the company tonight of one of America's leading journalists, the man, it's almost impossible to believe that for many years the leading television program, top-rated television program in the United States should be a program dealing with the news, with public affairs. And I think the one person who has been most important in making that possible is someone we all admire, Mike Wallace. I give you Mike Wallace.
Thank you. As Sandy said, for a few days now, for 2.5, 3 days now, at this ambitious and useful conference sponsored by the American University School of Communication and Freedom Forum, you've been exploring the various barriers to free expression around the globe, and they are formidable barriers. Government-imposed censorship, of course. Problems in covering civil wars, drug trafficking, the exercise of control over the media by public and/or private owners, government-dictated constraints on coverage of national security affairs, and for every barrier that you have discussed, one or more of you have suggested a solution or an end run. But some problems, some barriers, are too difficult to be attacked by a handful of mere journalists.